Hi friends, Jaden, Matthew, Kylie, Adeline, and Blaze. I'm so happy you're all here today. So let's go ahead and get started on today's lesson. In this lesson you will learn to add and subtract decimals. So this is the standard that we'll be going over. This is for adding and subtracting decimals. And like I said, you will learn and demonstrate adding decimals and subtracting decimals. So let's take a look at this lesson's guiding questions first. So why do we need to know how to add and subtract with decimals? How do we apply adding and subtracting rules with decimals? So why is it important? Knowing how to add and subtract decimals can come in very handy because we see them all over the place, right? Numbers with decimals are all over the place, so it's good to know how to work with them. And then, can any of you think of some numbers that have decimals in them that you might see in everyday life? That's right, Blaze. Decimals are in money. Yep. Oh, and Matthew. Very good. Decimals are in measurements. That's awesome. So here are some of the examples that we've talked about. They're in money amounts, like $4.99. They're in your gymnastics scores, or if you're in any kind of sport, a lot of times your score is going to be in a decimal. It's not going to be a whole number. They're even in shoe sizes. So some people wear a 6.5 or 7.5. And then lastly, measurements. Measurements are not always perfect. They're not always whole numbers. A lot of times, or most of the time, they're not. There's part of a whole in there. Okay, so these are your journal notes, and what I want you to do is refer to the worksheet that you should have in front of you right now, that you received, that have all these steps on them. So I'm just going to go through these steps, okay? So when you're adding and subtracting decimals, the first step is to line up the decimal points. Okay, and if we follow these steps every time we add and subtract decimals, you will ensure that you get the correct answer. If you don't follow the steps and you jumble everything together or don't stay organized, then you're more likely to make a mistake, right? Okay, so let's go over that first step again. The first step is to line up the decimal points. So this is very important because when you're adding and subtracting, you want to add numbers of the same value. Okay, so that means if you have a number in the tenths place, then you want the other number lined up with it in the tenths place. Or a number in the ones place, you want that lined up. Or the same thing, the hundreds place. That's why it's so important to line up the decimals. The only way to ensure that we're staying organized and adding and subtracting in the correct place is to line up the decimals. So step 2, you would, when you line up your decimals and those numbers, sometimes there's empty spots, and you need to put a 0 there in order for you to subtract or add. You need that as like a placeholder, and we'll look at some examples in a little bit. So then step 3, once you have everything lined up and stacked with your decimals and all your values in the correct spot, then you can add or subtract just like normal. Okay. And then lastly, when you get your final answer, you're going to bring down the decimal point with your final answer, so everything stays lined up. So we're going to refer to these steps when we do some practice problems. Okay, let's just talk about whole numbers real quick. So how well do you think you can add and subtract whole numbers and decimals now? You think you know how to do it already? Kylie, you think so? Okay. Well, you already have been. If you've been adding and subtracting whole numbers, then you've kind of been adding and subtracting decimals all along, because there's like an imaginary or understood decimal. So at the end of a whole number, there is like a decimal point, but you just don't see it. and it doesn't change the value of the number. For instance, 9 equals 9.0, 48 equals 48.0, 371 equals 371.0. So, so when you were adding whole numbers, those could be turned into decimals too. Alright. Okay, so let's look at an example of that. If you add the three example numbers together without the decimals, this is what it looks like. 371 plus 48 plus 9. Okay, so that's our answer just the way it looks normally. And then if you add decimals, that's what it looks like over here on this side. So can you tell me, what do you notice about the decimals in the expression on the right? Add a line? Yes, that's right, add a line. They're all lined up, right? So yeah, we have them in the right order. We have them lined up. Good job. Okay, so just a reminder, when we're adding and subtracting with decimals, we need to make sure that the decimal points are perfectly lined up before we can add or subtract. So let's just try to do some practice problems with decimals. We're going to kind of skip over some of this. This is regular subtracting, but we'll go over the rules real quick. And this subtraction poem is a good way to remember the subtraction rules. So I'm just going to kind of sing it or go over it with you. So it says, more on top, no need to stop. More on the floor, go next door and get 10 more. Numbers the same, zero's the game. Okay, so what that means is if you're subtracting and you have more numbers on top, you don't need to borrow. You just subtract. If you have more numbers on the bottom, you do need to go next door and borrow. You need to borrow a 10, right? And give it to that number that's smaller. And then if the numbers are the same, they're just going to be zeros, right? Like 5 minus 5 is just 0. So let's go ahead and get started on practicing with decimals. We're gonna skip over this whole numbers because okay, so we're gonna start on these practice problems. Okay, so Taylor has 2.7 feet piece of rope and an 11.25, 11 and 25 hundredths foot piece of rope. How many total feet of rope does Taylor have? Okay, so Jaden, what would be the first step for adding these decimals? Okay, good. Yep, that's right. We gotta line up the decimals, right? That's the first step. Okay, so start by lining up the decimals. And we have 11.25 plus 2.7. Add a line. What would be the next step? Great, that's right. We have to add a 0. Where is that 0 going to go? After the 7. Correct. Okay, so here is what it's going to look like with that 0. And the 2.7 and 2.70 have the same value, right? They don't change. Okay, so now we can just add them up. So we have 5 plus 2 plus, 2 plus 7 is 9. Bring down the decimal. 1 plus 2 is 3. Then bring down the 1. So Taylor has 13 and 95 hundredths feet of rope, or 13.95. Okay, let's see if you have this. Elena scored a 12.75 on the balance beam and a 14.6 on the uneven bars. What was Elena's combined score? So what is the first step? Matthew, can you tell me? Yes, that's right. Just lining up the decimals. It's always the first step. Okay, so this is 12.75 plus 14.6. The decimals are lined up. And Kylie, can you tell me the next step? Okay, good job. Add that 0. And that's going to go where? After the 6, right? Okay. So So now I can just add and subtract just like normal, right? Okay, so 5 plus 0 is 5. 7 plus 6 is 13. Carry the 1. 1 plus 2 plus 4 is 7. Also, we brought down that decimal. And we have 1 plus 1 is 2. So, Elena scored, her combined score was 27.35. Okay, great job. Now let's do some practice with subtracting decimals. So Adrian averages 22.8 points per game for his basketball team. Miles averages 9.2 points per game for his team. How many more points on average does Adrian score per game than Miles? So first, what would be the first step? Let's see. Adeline, can you tell me? Or Blaze? That's right, Blaze, thank you. So we're going to line up the decimals. And Blaze, can you also tell me what numbers are we going to subtract? What number are we putting first? Or what number are we subtracting from the other number? Okay, good. We're subtracting 9.2 from 22.8. So we can figure out what the difference is. So here we go. Now we need to put the placeholders, or the zeros, where they go. And we can subtract. So 8 take away 2 is going to be 6. Bring down that decimal point. We have to borrow in this case, right? And then the 2 becomes a 12. Then you minus 3, and then 1 minus 0 is 1. Adrian averages 13.6 more points per game than Miles. So let's try this one more problem. It's 7.65 miles from Franklin to Oak Hill. It's exactly 18 miles from Franklin to Derby. How much farther is it from Franklin to Derby than from Franklin to Oak Hill? So, Matthew, what numbers are we going to be subtracting? Yep, that's right, 18 and 7.65. And what is the first step? Thank you, Adeline. We have to line up those decimals. So 18 plus 7.65. What comes next? Jaden? Yep, add the zeros. We got the zeros, or let's see. There's understood decimals at the end of that 18, so we got to add some zeros to that, okay? Alright, very good. Be sure to add 2 zeros to help you subtract. Okay, I'm just going kind of fast through this, but we had to borrow from the 8, that became a 7. And then we gave the 0 a 1, so that became a 10. Then we had to borrow from it and turn that into a 9. Gave that 1, or that 10, to the 0. 10 take away 5 is going to be 5. 9 take away 6 is 3. 7 take away 7 is 0. And then bring down the 1. So we have 10.35. Alright, okay, so now guys, I want y'all to do some independent practice with these problems, okay? So what I want you to do is write these down on your notebook that you should have in front of you, your notebook paper, and try to solve number 1 independently. And then raise your hand when you have completed the first problem, and we'll review it together, okay? Okay. And then we'll go through all the problems, and at the end, we'll have some more independent practice. So go ahead and get started on that. Thank you, guys. Okay, so at this point, I would just continue letting them do some independent practice, and then I would check their work. We would work on this together, actually, and then at the end of the lesson, I would do a breakout session so that they would have their own problems to work on. And I would just come into their private room and just help them, give them feedback as they needed. So the students have notes. They have a worksheet to follow along with the steps. And then I called on the students just to make sure they were staying engaged. And the way that the breakout room is, I set it up so that the problems kind of match that student's academic level. And that would be the end of the lesson. Thank you.